Good afternoon, or evening, or extremely early morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the South Asia Initiative at Stanford. Today, we are discussing Kashmir, which has been, as you all know, a vexing and tragic issue that dates back to the very first days of Indian independence, but which has remained at the forefront of successive Indian governments. It's been the site of multiple wars, which I study. It's been the site of ongoing political instability and insecurity. And it's perennially been the sort of focal point of India's very identity and nationhood, right? And 3.5 years ago, in August of 2019, the Modi government abrogated what was known as Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which had previously given certain political parameters to Kashmir, and thereby changed Kashmir's political status. Today, we are going to explore that political and legal change, but specifically not from sort of political level in New Delhi, but specifically more what it means for people's daily lives in Kashmir itself. We're taking advantage today of having here at Stanford a long time and very close observer of exactly what that looks like, people's daily lives, both on the street and in the politics of Kashmir. Anuradha Bhasin is a John S. Knight Journalism Fellow this academic year here at Stanford. But for decades, she's been a journalist in Jammu and Kashmir. And she is the executive editor of the Kashmir Times, which is one of the oldest English language dailies in J&K. And she's also the author of this book, if you can see it. I don't know if the tech will allow it, A Dismantled State, recently published in India, which is an account essentially of Kashmir after Article 370. So welcome, Anuradha. As always, we on this session have a lot to get through, so I will make just one more housekeeping announcement. If you out there in Zoom land have questions, please do share them. Use the Q&A function, not the chat function. Time is short. As always, I will be ruthless, so please keep your questions short and to the point. Now, let's begin. And rather, if you would, could we start? Because for people who watch India and South Asia, this is a big headline, pivotal event, the abrogation of 370. But for those who may not be as familiar, could you give us very briefly a little bit of background on what happened in August 2019? And specifically, let's begin actually with before August 2019. What was Article 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution? What did it mean for Kashmir and for Kashmiri people?
Okay, this is very difficult to condense and say it in brief, but I'll try my best to just briefly talk about what really Article 370 and Article 35A were. Primarily Article 370. This affirmed the special status of Jammu and Kashmir, which is the full form of the Kashmir state as it is known more commonly world over. And it also affirmed the peculiar history of Jammu and Kashmir and its accession to India. It was thus a constitutional bridge between Kashmir and rest of India. And it came about after J&K's accession to India under very peculiar circumstances. The constitutional recognition of the conditions under which Kashmir had acceded to India were that, which was that, J&K would manage all the affairs of Jammu and Kashmir, and only defense, foreign affairs, and communication would be with India. So this is what it actually underlined, the Article 370. Barring defense, foreign affairs, and communication, all other matters would be dealt by within the state internally. So the Article 370 thus reflected and cemented the contractual rights and obligations of the two parties, that is Jammu and Kashmir and India. The Article 370, the accession of Jammu and Kashmir to India was different from the other accessions because this was one instrument of accession where when the monarch of Jammu and Kashmir in 1947, when he signed this instrument, he stated specifically that nothing in this instrument shall be deemed to commit me to accept any future constitution of India or to fetter his discretion into entering into arrangements with the government of India under any such future constitution. It was also appended by a letter that the monarch wrote stating the exceptional conditions of how he was compelled to sign the accession because the tribal invaders from Northwest Frontier Province, which is east of the Indian subcontinent, west of the Indian subcontinent, had entered, and India was willing to render help only on the condition of signing the instrument of accession. He also talked about how Jammu and Kashmir, unlike the other princely states which had acceded to either of the two dominions, were contiguous geographically and culturally to both dominions. And in response to that, that letter and instrument of accession, the Lord Mountbatten, who was the last viceroy of India, had replied that as soon as law and order would be restored in Kashmir and its soil would be cleared of invaders, the question of states' accession should be settled by a reference to the people. So these were the very different and special circumstances in which Article 370 came about, and Article 335A, which came much later in 1954, came via a presidential order, but it was only a clarificatory provision that defined who a permanent resident of Jammu and Kashmir is. So this Article 370 was hollowed out through several presidential orders and legislations even before 2019. For instance, 260 out of 395 articles of the Indian Constitution were already applicable to the state before 2019. But what was left of the special status of Jammu and Kashmir was not insignificant. Despite the many dilutions, the Article 370 continued to confer on its permanent residents special and exclusive rights like employment in state government services, business investments, acquisition and of immovable property. So for people of Jammu and Kashmir, it meant protection of these rights. That was significant itself. So when the Article 370 was abrogated on August 5th, 2019, it meant that the people had a lot to lose.
Right, that's a perfect segue because I wanted to thank you for that background. That gives us a sense of just how sort of politically distinct Kashmir was, and indeed you've also sort of foreshadowed for us the significance of 35A, which we'll come back to a little bit later. But before we get ahead of ourselves, you've given us a segue about August the 5th. Tell us what happened on August the 5th in Delhi, and what did it look like on the ground in J&K?
Oh, well, when Article 370 was revoked in the Indian Parliament, and along with that, Jammu and Kashmir was dismembered and divided into two union territories that would now be, it was no longer a state. And that meant that it would be directly controlled by New Delhi. And this was done by putting the Jammu and Kashmir reorganization bill to vote in the parliament, and this was passed by a majority. And constitutionally, this could not have been done. Only the Jammu and Kashmir Constituent Assembly, that was framed for framing the constitution of Jammu and Kashmir, had the right to take any decision on Article 370. After the framing of J&K Constitution, this was disbanded in 1956. But using modification powers under the Indian and J&K Constitution, this power could have been transferred to an elected body of representatives of Jammu and Kashmir, which is known as the J&K State Assembly. But that had been dissolved in 2018. And J&K had been put under direct president rule. So what the Indian government did was, while revoking Article 370, is to transfer the power of the Constituent Assembly directly to the president and through the president to the parliament. And this raises constitutional questions, which are, and these have been challenged in the Supreme Court, but no hearings have taken place. And this was done where in the parliament where Jammu and Kashmir had minimal representation, and it was decided by the brute majority of that the BJP enjoys in the parliament. And at the ground, things were very, very different. The government had imposed curfew-like restrictions across Jammu and Kashmir. It banned internet and all other communication, including mobile phones and landline phones. And the curbs were much harsher in the Muslim majority areas. And these were only partially observed in the Hindu areas and the Buddhist Ladakh. So that meant that out of 14 million people of Jammu and Kashmir, 9 were virtually pushed behind an iron wall. There was little or no information about the areas that were facing a stringent communication ban. Bits and scraps poured out of Srinagar, the main capital city, where the major news was that the entire political leadership of Kashmir, which included separatists and pro-India leaders, and also 3 former chief ministers, had been jailed. But about the other areas, there was no information. And as far as lives of common people were concerned, they were immensely impacted. People had no access to healthcare, for instance, because of curfew-like situation, because there was lack of phones. They could not call for an ambulance. Those who suffered serious ailments, they had to trek to the nearest hospitals. And the nearest hospitals in remote hilly areas are often very distantly located. The poor could not avail of health welfare schemes because these were digitized. The doctors did not have internet or phone access, which is necessary for their work. Schools were shut for several months. Businesses were shut. Journalists were unable to perform. And
no, that's so there's a lot to unpack there, and we'll sort of go through it a bit more systematically. But maybe it will help us as we unpack it systematically. If you could, I should ask you first, what was the government's motivation for doing this, for the abrogation of 370? And the corollary of that is, what was the government's motivation for the sort of ancillary measures it took on information and security, right? Because there was a big influx also of uniformed security personnel. There was, as you said, this blackout of internet and cell phones. So what was the motivation for doing the abrogation of 370? And associated with that, the motivation for the way it was implemented with the security and information practices?
The motivation was clear. It has been a long-held policy and dream of BJP to abrogate Article 370. It has included that in its many election manifestos. And BJP's parent organization, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak, which is about 100 years old, its core ideology is to create a Hindu nation, turn India into a Hindu nation. So for the RSS, Kashmir, which is the only Muslim majority state, is a major impediment to creating that Hindu state, Hindu nation. And also that many RSS ideologues in the last several decades have openly advocated that Kashmir can be resolved by changing the demography of Jammu and Kashmir, which is to say that, so that it becomes more amenable for creating a Hindu nation. And on the ground, while they were doing all of this, there was massive militarization of Kashmir to do it. But elsewhere in India, what the government was saying was something very, very different. For people in Kashmir, while it looked like that their civil liberties were being crushed while making the changes, bringing about the legal changes or revoking Article 370, what the government was saying, and essentially the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi or his Home Minister Amit Shah, right after the revocation, they said that this is going to bring in a new era of peace. Terrorism is going to go, there's going to be more democracy, there's going to be more equality, and this will bring about development. And this was pretty ironic because on the ground, more forces had been called in, civil liberties were completely trampled, and whatever the conditions on the ground, they defied any kind of a democratic principle, because the people of Jammu and Kashmir were really not involved or had any say in what was happening.
So you were a newspaper editor at this time. So can you, from that perspective, from your vantage as being an editor of a newspaper before 2019 and after the August the 5th, how did that role change for you?
It completely changed. It had a chilling effect on what I was doing. Before 2019, my daily drill included, constantly receiving and making phone calls, getting WhatsApp messages from reporters, stringers, from sources, and scanning the internet for information. And I was stationed in Jammu, which is a Hindu majority area, and the internet was barred, where the internet was barred partially. So the information was meager, but there was no information about the areas that had been completely barricaded physically and virtually. So I went to feeling very helpless. I moved the Supreme Court against the internet ban. And one of the pleas was that this was a fundamental right for for the press to work ably. A favorable verdict did come, but it came 5 months later. And during those 5, in fact, it took yet another month for the government to implement and restore the internet. So gradually, through those 6 months, we learned to work around the internet blockade, picking up whatever little information was existing in the public domain, and my staffers, like all other journalists, were compelled to work out of a government-facilitated center where 3 computers with very poor internet connectivity were set up. And this meant that about 200 journalists had to jostle for space. And at the most, you could get only about 15 minutes, which is not enough to do your work. And so there were times when they were unable to file stories. And even when they were able to file the stories, they were unable to part with much information, because working from the center meant that they were working under complete surveillance. And this induced a lot of fear. Also that for 2 months, we were unable to publish the Srinagar edition of Kashmir Times. But even after the restoration of internet, as journalists gradually began to resume their normal work, and some of them were doing good investigative stories or trying to do it, they were suddenly faced with newer challenges, and the newer challenges were more harsh forms of unannounced censorship, like summons for any critical story, even a critical word, raids on the houses and offices of journalists. Some of the journalists have been arrested. There are criminal cases lodged against many others. And this has now become the norm and made it extremely impossible for journalists to operate. The local newspapers no longer publish anything that is critical of the government. And in fact, they are compelled to carry on their front pages only content that publicizes the government's achievements. We suffered as a consequence because we did not toe the line. In October 2020, our office at the Kashmir Times in Srinagar was sealed, and that stopped our Srinagar edition. Our Jammu edition is still continuing, but we are unable to do much because we are financially impacted by the crisis, and our staffers are scared to work freely. So this is the kind of impact that it has had.
But one thing that I want to understand a little bit better is how that contrasts to life before 2019, right? Surely life before 2019 for truth-seeking journalists in J&K was also not ideal, right? So how did your life, but I'm talking here about your work as a journalist, as a newspaper editor, how did it compare after August the 5th with before that? Was it a different type of threat, or was it a whole different level of threat as well?
Yes, it was a different kind of threat and a whole different level at the same time. Journalism in Kashmir was never easy. It was always a challenge, a very difficult challenge, but there have been ups and downs. The 1990s were one of the worst, because that's when insurgency broke out, and it was a crazy mess where journalists were caught between the guns of security forces and the militants. And there were several different militant groups, and they all wanted their voice and the other voices to be, drowned out. So there were physical threats that journalists face. They were kidnapped, they were threatened, they were tortured, they were killed. So about 19 journalists have been killed up till 2018 since 1990. But things had become slightly better after 2000 for a couple of years. That was a time that coincided with peace process, and the hold of the guns on the two sides minimized. Militancy was witnessing a decrease, and the security forces were also not that forthcoming. So this was a period that saw a mushrooming growth of newspapers and journalists, qualitatively and quantitatively. But after 2010, we saw another new phase of Kashmir's resistance. There was street protests, and there was a gradual upsurge in militancy also, particularly after the way the street protests had been brutally targeted. But the threats that journalists navigated mostly came from the state after 2010. Sometimes these were direct, sometimes through arm twisting. And it was easy to arm twist journalists because newspaper businesses were pretty much reliant on government advertising for their revenue. Yet, despite all this, there was some resistance by journalists to some of the methods of control and intimidation. There were solidarity spaces that were existing, and the state was often responsive. There were channels of communication between the state and the journalists that worked both ways. But today we just have an arrogant state cracking down on journalists for doing their job. And that is the only communication that there exists between the state and the journalists. And that is the difference.
Yeah, that's interesting, because you're suggesting that it's now not just a matter of random violence. It's not ad hoc, but it's systematic.
Yes.
It's a systematic matter of policy. So speaking of systematic and speaking of state action, let me focus a little bit on the security picture. You've mentioned a couple of times, and I mentioned in passing, that there was an elevated security presence around the time of 370. Just on that security picture itself, how did that manifest itself? Were there, for example, restrictions in ordinary people's movements? And how did that affect the recently before 2019 upsurge in militancy? So what was the effect of the increased security presence on people's normal lives and on the security situation in Kashmir?
Okay, so to begin with, what impact did it have on people's lives? Well, the streets, as I mentioned earlier, there was almost a curfew-like situation in most parts of Jammu and Kashmir. Streets were barricaded. Massive arrests had taken place, and there was a unique pattern of arresting people, detaining them. Some of them were detained for prolonged periods, sent to jails outside Kashmir, and others would be detained for a couple of hours. They would be released. They would be sometimes rearrested, and there was repeated harassment through security forces suddenly entering certain areas, smashing window panes, or damaging people's food supplies. There were also cases of torture, but Kashmir has seen more blood and gore, much more blood and gore in the past. So it wasn't as bloody, but there was this systemic way of inducing fear in public mind through a cycle of arrests, through a cycle of repeated harassment after the arrest, and particularly if some people who were arrested or tortured had spoken to the media. And how much of that is still going on, we have no means of finding out, because the reporters and sources at the ground have been silenced. People are scared to talk. They fear that they may be arrested, they may lose their jobs, they may invite a raid by some anti-terror forces to their homes. They may just be disappeared or killed. This pretty much broadly sums up what people are going through. And as far as the security situation is concerned, whereas the government says that militancy is under control, the truth is just the opposite. The government quotes certain statistics that are based only on the number of militants that are killed. There is no adequate data about how many new militants are joining militancy. And besides, it's also silent about the new form of militancy. Before 2019, the armed insurgents usually targeted security installations. the army, the paramilitary forces. Now they are targeting the unarmed civilians more and more. And these are often targeted killings. People picked up selectively and targeted for their religion. So a lot of several Hindus have been killed, several poor laborers who have been living in Kashmir and working in Kashmir as petty laborers, they have been killed. And so more civilian killings are extremely worrying. And besides that, the security situation is also threatened externally. Jammu and Kashmir is a border area and strategically located, where its neighbors are China and Pakistan. And so while China used Article 370 revocation as an excuse to guzzle up some territories in Ladakh region, the situation in from the Pakistan side has always been hostile, and there are worries that in the post the new Afghanistan situation, there is a possibility that there could be a free flow of arms and weapons and trained men entering Kashmir whenever that may be feasible for other stakeholders. So there are external threats as well.
Yeah, indeed. There's already been reporting of some, at least some arms flowing from Afghanistan to India.
Yeah, sticky bombs.
Right. So just to finish off on the security thing, two questions come to mind. One is, as you're describing this pattern of, as you said, less lethal but still harassment and intimidation, as you're describing this pattern, can you explain to us India as a constitutional republic with the rule of law should have recourse for people through the judicial system? Why does that system not work? Why is there? Why do you think that the security forces can, with impunity, wage this campaign of intimidation and not and the citizens have no redress for it?
Yeah, true. That was a problem even before 2019, because after insurgency erupted in Jammu and Kashmir in 1989-90, Armed Forces Special Powers Act was brought in and extended to Jammu and Kashmir, which gives the armed forces, which is the paramilitary forces, including the army, the CRPF, and the other Indian security agencies, the unbridled freedom to arrest people, to torture them, to detain them. And it led to a huge, at a huge level, massive human rights violations, including enforced disappearances. There are people who were picked up from their homes and disappeared in custody, and we don't know what happened to them, apart from the fact that there were people who were killed, and they were passed off as militants. And the security forces under this Armed Forces Special Powers Act enjoy impunity, because it gives them impunity against judicial accountability. They cannot be tried in civil courts. And that remains pretty much a problem even today. And not just that, I mean, earlier at least people had the courage to approach courts if they felt they were violated. They took up their cases with the civil society organizations working on human rights. They took it up publicly, they protested, they raised it up with media. Now today there's a complete silence about if there are any kind of human rights violations going on. We really don't know, because the people are not as forthcoming. There have been one or two incidents that did come to limelight, and there was one very recent one where a person was killed 2 months after he was picked up from his home and by the Indian Army. But whereas the army says that he escaped the high security camp or army camp, his family has said that he was just disappeared and killed, and questioned that how could he have escaped that high security fully securitized army camp where he was put up.
So if the government claims, as you mentioned, that militancy is now under control, does that mean that the security presence in the valley and indeed other parts of the Union territories has returned to a quote unquote normal? Granted that the baseline of normal was always different, but has it come back to the pre-370 abrogation baseline?
Normalcy always has a different definition in Kashmir, but even if you go by that definition, Kashmir still remains heavily militarized. And that is what people deal with in their day-to-day lives. We haven't seen any forces being withdrawn, or I haven't heard of any trimming down of troops within Jammu and Kashmir. So that pretty much remains the same.
Okay. So let's move on past the security issue. Let's take a look at the broader picture now. What happened on the 5th of August 2019 was not a one-off instance, right? It was the biggest headline grabbing piece of policy, but there was also a raft of subsequent legislation, right? And indeed, you mentioned 35A as well. Let's start with 35A. Can you explain, as you mentioned, it's in per se, all it does is define what is a permanent resident of Kashmir, but can you explain the implications of that? Once that article is abrogated, what does that mean that the government in New Delhi can do, or what does that leave open for governments to do when 35A no longer exists?
So Article 35A, as I mentioned earlier, is a clarificatory provision that allows securitizes the rights of the people of Jammu and Kashmir who had been residents of Jammu and Kashmir before 1947. So they had protection with respect to land, they had protection with respect to businesses, and to admissions to higher institutions of learning, things like that. So very few outsiders could invest in business. There was limited investment that was allowed from outside to ensure that there was also development. But most of the lands, businesses, jobs, they were privileges of the local people, and outsiders could not come and settle in. So it meant that once you have removed Article 370, so you've removed that shield of protection. And that is exactly what happened. Because there were several laws that were introduced after 2019, for instance, primarily the land-related laws. So there were about, I think, 26 laws that were repealed or amended in October 2020, 1 year after the abrogation. And these have by and large changed the nature of land laws. So for instance, Kashmir had its own land-related law, or several laws, where the state was the biggest owner of the land, but it was also the protector of people's rights. Lands were often given to people on leases for residential, agricultural, or business purposes. Other than that, in 1950s, we saw the landmark land reforms, which have not happened anywhere else in India, which was to give land to the tillers. And subsequently, also, there were laws that offered extra protection to agrarian communities to carry on their practices. So in one stroke, these were all gone. And the new laws, on the other hand, made it easier for the government to acquire huge land holdings in the name of security or development. And though they introduced and extended a fair compensation act for acquisition of land, the fair compensation, when it comes to being paid, this is not being adhered to. And various loopholes are being used, which were tied to the previous land laws. So lands which were earlier earmarked for certain purposes, but had not been fully regularized because previous governments were corrupt, they were complacent. These lands are now being declared as state lands, and people are already using these lands for various purposes. And those people are now being evicted from these lands. Their homes that were built on these lands, or their businesses that were built on these lands, these are being demolished without any adequate notice, without even giving them a chance to be heard. They are being declared encroachers and land grabbers without even verifying if they have the papers or not. And that's one of the main changes that has happened and taken place.
So this brings up the sort of broader point that one of the government's main justifications for abrogating 370 was that it would open the way to greater economic development, right? Investment from the rest of India into J&K and Ladakh now. Has that happened? What has been the sort of economic impact of the abrogation of 370 and 35A? Has it achieved even some of the economic benefits that were promised?
It's difficult to say at the moment, but one of the things that the government is talking about is tourism. And yes, indeed, there has been a boost to tourism, but tourism is not something new to Kashmir. There have been ups and downs in the tourism industry in Kashmir, and because of its situation also primarily. But there have been periods when there was a lot of tourism, and particularly from 2010 to 2014, which is before the Modi government. And that kind of tourism is back, which means that people connected with tourism can benefit out of that. Now, at the same time, you have the hotel industry, which is impacted by the land laws, because much of the hotels were constructed on leased lands, the lands that were leased by the government to promote tourism. So they are being ousted of these lands, and those hotels that they were constructed and they invested in for decades are going to be auctioned are going to be put up for open auction, which means that people with deeper pockets from bigger cities in India, or the bigger crony capitalists, they are going to get these lands by paying a pittance, while the locals are completely marginalized. And the same is true of other contracts and investments. Jammu and Kashmir is a Himalayan belt. It is rich in mineral resources. It is rich in water resources. So businessmen and contractors from outside, when they're competing with the locals, the former have an edge. The locals get more and more marginalized, and they are being completely dominated. And besides, these businessmen from outside, they're using more sophisticated machinery for extraction of, say, minerals and sand from the riverbeds, which, unlike previously, which it was done manually, so it had lesser ecological impact on the fragile Himalayan belt of Jammu and Kashmir. Now it is going to have a huge ecological impact. And already within 3 years, we do hear of fears of flooding, landslides, more and more of that happening. So even if there are ways to show that there has been huge investment, does it really mean anything for people in Jammu and Kashmir who are not part of that development process and who only get to bear the adverse ecological impact of it?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point that I think I very rarely hear about, right? The impact of this, which policy, which is presumed to have a political / demographic / economic security motivation, actually having unintended consequences on the ecology of the place it's a big thought. A lot of people, including some people in our audience, have brought up the fact that this may offer, the abrogation of 370 may offer a chance for in offering a chance for other Indian investment into J&K. It may, to put it in the most polite way, offer a form of redress to the Kashmiri pundit population that exodus out of the state in 1990s. That this is essentially a form of belated, if not justice, then at least redress. Is there any indication that the pundit population or parts of it have returned to the state, or to the Union Territory, I should say?
No, in fact, just the converse. There were about 8,000 Kashmiri Pandits still living in Kashmir. I mean, these are the Pandits who had never left Kashmir Valley. And there was an additional about 5,000 people who benefited from the rehabilitation policy that started during the time that Congress government was in power, and this is much before Mr. Modi became Prime Minister. And that policy is something that he continued, and he added a few more families to that. So there were about these 3,000 to 5,000 people who had, or families that had benefited from that rehabilitation package, which promised them jobs, but they had to go back to the valley, and which they availed of, and they were living there, and they had not, of course, they were facing a lot of problems, but there were no massive security issues that they were dealing with. Instead, what has happened is post 2019, that as I mentioned earlier, militancy has taken over a whole new form, and a lot of civilians are now being attacked, and particularly Kashmiri Pandits. The employees have, in the last 1 year, they have fled back to Jammu, and where till about a couple of days ago, they were protesting, and they were on protest. they have decided not to go back, and they are demanding that they be posted in safer areas. So that is a fact. I also know of few families that, and that may not be a general scenario, but some of the Kashmiri Pandit families who had never moved out are now thinking of moving out from Kashmir. And this has been an impact of Article 370, which is just the reverse of what the government was promising. The Article 370, just to add that, Article 370 was never a hindrance in Kashmiri Pandits staying in Kashmir Valley. They were dislodged from Kashmir Valley because of insurgency and because of security situation, not because of 370.
No, completely. Can you just explain that last thing that you said about some of them now considering leaving as a result of 370? What is the logic there?
The logic is that because of 370, after 370, there have been incidents when there have been selective killings. People who had been staying in the valley, they have been targeted in the last 2 years. And this wasn't happening earlier. This is creating a whole new set of anxieties and fear in the minds of Kashmiri Pandits. So I cannot say if that's a larger sample, but some of the people that I know back in Kashmir and have been in touch with, they are contemplating moving out of Kashmir.
Sure. Thank you. One of the other, we've got a question from Zoom, from the audience. One of the other segments of the population that I wonder what the effect of 370 has been on is women. What has been the effect, if any, on the women of Jammu and Kashmir of 370? And the person on Zoom notes that there were previous to abrogation central laws in India, Government of India laws that protected women's rights that were not applicable to J&K. Do you know what that's a reference to? And or more broadly, do you have any comment on women's rights and economic prospects as a result of 370?
This is much more nuanced, and I think there are more myths that have been propagated in the name of, women were not equal and did not have equal rights. This usually refers to the permanent resident status that, the permanent resident certificate that used to legitimize that, give legitimacy to that. So the permanent resident certificate somewhere, and this is something that has been carried on from the times of the monarchs, brought into the post-1947 era. And these certificates, somewhere in 1960s, there was a minister in a Jammu-based Hindu minister who took the executive decision of, appending the stamp of valid till marriage in the case of women. And that did challenge some of the women who were working women, particularly, or those who wanted to purchase property after they had been married outside. It challenged their seniority in government positions. It challenged their jobs. It challenged their right to buy land. And they had moved the court. So these cases went on for 2 decades, I think. And finally, a decision on this, there was some clarity. There was always ambiguity on how it would be used. So not all women were affected, but yes, definitely many women were impacted by these decisions that had been arbitrarily taken. But these petitions were finally decided in 2002. And 2000, I think definitely by 2003, it was absolutely clear. The court had laid down that women could not be discriminated against on the basis of, who they married. So that meant that there was absolute equality even before that. What has happened after 370 is that, there were certain things that there was right to free education in Jammu and Kashmir. And when the free education is taken away, it's the women who are going to suffer much more. In the professional colleges, like the engineering colleges, colleges of medicine, there was 50% reservation for women. I'm not sure if that is still continuing.
Yeah, that's an important point to bear in mind. We in the West also forget that we sometimes box in certain very narrow issues as women's issues, but in fact, basic points of economic equality and egalitarianism are actually fundamentally women's issues because they are disproportionately affected. So it's a fair point. We're nearly out of time, so I have two last questions. One is, we've been talking all this time so far today about Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir. One of the other outcomes of the 5th of August, as you mentioned at the outset, was the bifurcation of what was previously J&K into J&K and Ladakh as two different union territories. Is there anything to say about how all of these changes have been, is there any differential impact of these changes on Ladakh? Or are the things that you have been talking about more or less applicable also in Ladakh as they are in J&K?
More or less, they're applicable in the same way. The only thing is that the Ladakh will now have, will not have an elected assembly. Jammu and Kashmir is supposed to have an elected assembly, but there are no elections in sight. But other than that, I mean, Ladakhis for years had been demanding union territory status. Now, this is interesting. They always felt that they were being discriminated under Kashmiri Muslim domination. And this is to some extent, yes, the area was neglected, and that's also because of where it was located and of its very difficult topography. It's a huge area. It's a cold desert. It has less than 3 lakh people, which are sparsely, so the population distribution is very, very sparse and spread over a larger area. And the conditions of living in Ladakh are extremely tough. And so because of that, also the people were neglected. So right now, if the same conditions are applicable and Ladakh is being open to outsiders as well for settling in, for business investments, and so on and so forth, the people of Ladakh are extremely worried, because for them, preserving their ecological balance is crucial to their existence. And the new laws, which are similarly impacting them, they feel that they have been politically and economically disempowered. There were recent protests in Ladakh over what the government is doing. And interestingly, now many Ladakhis are also saying that they were better off previously, under the previous arrangement as it existed before 2019.
Thank you. My last question for you is about the future, right? We've been talking about the last 3 years or so, post 2019. And granted, I'm sure a lot has yet to shake out, and we're yet to see the full effects of what has happened, or what has transpired. But if you were to put on your long-time analyst hat, what is your sense of, the government's future agenda? Like we said, right? It wasn't just a one-off thing on the 5th of August. This was what the abrogation of 370 and 35A was the keystone of a raft of other measures that were taken. Is more yet to come? How will the situation in your eyes, evolve as we go forward?
I think the basic structure and frameworks are pretty much in place. If the aim is to disempower the people and to allow the existence of only one kind of a narrative, the framework for that is pretty much in place. There may be, through these attempts to change the demography of Jammu and Kashmir, which may take a few decades from now, if that can happen. And so only, I think, actions to that end are going to be taken in the to that end, because the frameworks are already laid, the system has already been set down, and it's just going to continue like that. But I also wonder, how can they really get away with what is happening? I wonder about how the security situation will pan out. What will trigger from the discontent that is deepening within Jammu and Kashmir, and about how, what kind of an ecological impact this will have on the region. And would these things shape the future narrative as well? All this remains to be seen.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's as I said at the outset, this is a tragedy and a problem that has beset India from the first days of independence, and it's a policy challenge that will be ongoing. We are at the end. I want to thank you so much, because we, especially after 370, the information that we get about Kashmir is so often framed in a narrative about the central government's policy and the debate over that policy. It's so rare to get a fine-grained insight into what is happening in J&K and Ladakh itself. So I want to thank you for that. And in particular, I was really struck by how this is not. So, I am guilty of looking at this part of the world from a securitized lens, right? As an issue of foreign and security policy. But clearly, even issues like 370 are not just about politics. It's not just about ideology. It's not even about economic development. It touches everything from underrepresented groups to the ecology of that part of the world, which is so fragile. So thank you for shining a light on all of that.
Thank you so much. A pleasure talking. Yeah.
Thank you.